It is a little past 5 in the evening in November of 1875, and the Great Hall of Euston Station is doing the one thing it does better than almost any room in London, which is make departure look like ceremony. The hall rises more than 60 feet above the stone floor, a Roman temple of a room built for a railway company that wanted travellers to understand, the moment they stepped through the door, that what they were about to do was significant. Gas lamps burn in long rows along the galleries, their light catching on brass fittings and on the damp shoulders of coats that have just come in from the rain. A porter in a company waistcoat is calling out platform numbers to nobody in particular. Somewhere beyond the hall, past the iron and glass of the train shed, an engine is building up steam with a low, patient hiss, and the whole building seems to lean very slightly toward that sound, the way a room leans toward its own center of gravity. A woman crosses the hall toward the platform gates, and for a moment she is worth watching, because she is clearly dressed for the occasion of travel the way a Victorian woman of her station was expected to. Her cloak is dark wool, well brushed, the kind of garment chosen specifically because it will not show soot. Her bonnet is small and practical rather than fashionable, tied firmly enough to survive a gust of wind on an open platform. She carries a leather bag in one gloved hand and a folded newspaper in the other, and she walks with the particular composure of someone who has rehearsed, in her own mind, exactly how a respectable woman travels alone. Her boots strike the stone floor in a steady rhythm. Her chin is level. If you had to guess her situation from her bearing alone, you might guess governess, or companion, or perhaps a tradesman's widow travelling to visit family, and you would not be far wrong. Above her, painted across an indicator board and printed in the timetable folded inside her bag, the railway company has arranged the entire evening into a grid of departures and arrivals, each one accurate to the minute. Each one a small promise that the 19th century's most extraordinary machine will do exactly what it says it will do. The London and North Western Railway will take her from this hall to Manchester in a matter of hours, across nearly 200 miles of English countryside that a coach and horses, a single lifetime earlier, would have taken the better part of 2 days to cross. That fact alone, if she paused to consider it, was a kind of miracle. Her own grandmother had never travelled faster than a cantering horse. She is about to travel faster than any human being in the history of the world had travelled on land before her own century began, and she is about to do it while sitting quietly in a compartment with a stranger entirely unremarked upon. Because by 1875 this miracle has already become an errand. Further down the platform, a family says its goodbyes with the particular formality the era expected of public emotion. A father shaking his grown son's hand rather than embracing him. A mother pressing a parcel of sandwiches into a daughter's gloved hands with instructions that carry on rather longer than the daughter appears to want them to. A dog barks somewhere near the luggage vans. The smell of the place is its own kind of portrait. Coal smoke layered over hot oil and wet wool, and faintly beneath all of it, the sweetness of the pastry stall near the entrance. A combination that any regular traveller of the period would have recognized instantly, and that no engraving could ever quite capture. The scene has a genuine grandeur to it, and it deserves to be seen clearly before anything else is said. Because the grandeur is not a lie. The engine really was a marvel of applied engineering. The glass roof overhead really did represent one of the great structural achievements of the age. The timetable in her bag really did compress a journey that would have broken her grandmother's understanding of what a single day could contain. Illustrated newspapers of the period loved to print engravings of exactly this scene, the departing train wreathed in steam and romance, the travellers dignified, the machine obedient. It is, in every sense the era wanted it to be, a picture of progress. What that picture leaves out is what happens the moment she passes through the platform gate, and a guard, following a company rule that exists for reasons she has never been told, closes the door of her compartment and turns a key in it from the outside. It leaves out the 4 or 5 hours she is about to spend sealed inside a wooden box, roughly the size of a modern closet, with no corridor to walk, no lavatory to use, no way to summon help, and a stranger sitting directly across from her, whose name she does not know and whose intentions she has no way of verifying. It leaves out the soot that will settle on her gloves before Manchester, the ash that may drift through the open window and land, still glowing, on the wool of her cloak, and the particular kind of fear that a certain notorious crime, 11 years old by 1875 but nowhere close to forgotten, has taught every English traveller to carry quietly onto every train they board. The story of what her evening actually involves is far stranger, far more uncomfortable, and far more revealing of what the Victorians were willing to risk for speed than any engraving of a departing train was ever built to show. This is 1875, and Britain has spent the better part of 4 decades falling in love with a machine that is, by any honest accounting, one of the most dangerous ordinary objects a Victorian person could willingly climb inside. The railway has rearranged the entire shape of British life in less time than it takes most technologies to earn a name. Shrinking distances, standardizing habits, moving goods and letters and marriageable daughters and desperate job seekers across a landscape their grandparents would have needed a week to cross. It has also killed and maimed people in numbers that a modern passenger would find deeply alarming, through mechanisms so specific to the design of the Victorian railway carriage that most of them simply do not exist anymore. This account is about that machine, and about the woman walking toward it right now, and about exactly what she is agreeing to when she steps up into her compartment and hears the guard's key turn in the lock behind her. Every stratum of British society that rode the rails in 1875 was navigating a version of this same bargain, whether they thought about it in those terms or not. Speed for isolation, distance for danger. A miracle of engineering wrapped around a set of hazards the companies themselves rarely advertised and frequently minimized. Strip away the romance of the departing train, the steam and the gaslight and the polished brass, and what is left underneath is a body sealed into a wooden compartment moving faster than the human nervous system had ever evolved to travel, with remarkably little standing between that body and whatever the journey happened to bring. Before we go further, if this kind of unpolished history is something you value, if you would rather sit with the real texture of the Victorian world than the postcard version of it, take a moment to subscribe. It helps this channel keep doing this particular kind of work. And if one detail tonight stays with you, the locked door, the missing lavatory, the murder that changed how an entire nation thought about train travel, leave a comment about it. I do read every one. Let us begin, then, with the woman herself, and with the specific evening that is about to close in around her the moment that door is locked. Her name, for the purposes of this account, is Eliza Marsh, and on this particular November evening she is 32 years old, standing a little above average height for a woman of her time, with the upright economical posture of someone who spent a decade being paid to model good deportment for other people's children. She was born in Warwickshire, the daughter of a schoolmaster, and she married young, at 22, to a solicitor's clerk named Thomas Marsh, a steady, unremarkable man with good handwriting and modest ambitions who died of typhoid fever 2 years ago in the summer of 1873, leaving her a widow with no children, a small quantity of debt, and considerably less financial security than either of them had ever quite allowed themselves to worry about while he was alive. Her body, under the plain wool cloak, tells a story of careful economy rather than hardship. She is not thin in the way poverty makes a person thin. She eats regularly, if plainly, and her hands, ungloved for a moment, as she checks the clasp of her bag, are smooth rather than work-roughened. The hands of a woman who has spent her adult life indoors, minding children, keeping accounts, arranging flowers for other people's dinner tables. She carries herself with a stillness that took real effort to cultivate. the specific, trained composure of a governess and companion who has spent years being watched, assessed, and quietly judged by employers deciding whether she was a suitable influence on their daughters. Her face is unremarkable in the way that respectable Victorian women were trained to make their faces unremarkable in public. Though anyone who watched her closely enough would notice her eyes moving constantly across the crowd, cataloguing exits, counting the number of men standing near the platform gate. In the particular, habitual vigilance of a woman who has learned, the hard way, that travelling alone requires a kind of attention men of her class were never asked to develop. She had met Thomas at a church social in Warwickshire when she was 19, a quiet, careful young man, 3 years her senior, who courted her with a patience she had found, at the time, almost frustrating, and who proposed only once he had calculated, to his own satisfaction, that his clerk's salary could support a household. It was not a romance out of a novel. It was steady and companionable and, in its own undemonstrative way, quite happy, and losing him at 30 had rearranged the entire architecture of her expected life with a suddenness she still has not fully adjusted to, 2 years on. She keeps his watch. She keeps very little else. What the crowd cannot see, watching her cross the hall, is the letter folded inside her bag alongside the newspaper, a written offer of a position as companion and occasional governess to the 2 younger daughters of a mill-owning family named Ashworth, settled a few miles outside Manchester, secured largely on the strength of a character reference and a sample of her handwriting, which a previous employer had once called the clearest hand she had encountered in 20 years of correspondence. It is a small, private vanity, that handwriting, one of the only things about herself Eliza has ever allowed herself to feel simply proud of rather than merely adequate at, and it is, in a very literal sense, the reason she is standing in this hall at all. Her furniture is sold, her rooms in London are given up. Everything she owns that matters to her fits into the single leather bag in her hand and a trunk already loaded into the guard's van at the front of the train, and by tomorrow morning she will be someone else's employee in a city she has never once visited. She reaches the platform gate, presents her ticket, a second-class fare rather than first, chosen with the same careful arithmetic she has applied to every decision since Thomas died, and a railway official directs her toward a compartment 3 carriages back. She climbs up, settles herself on a seat upholstered in worn blue cloth, and glances across at the only other occupant of the compartment, a man in a dark coat who nods once, politely, and returns his attention to a newspaper. She nods back. She says nothing more than that. Moments later, the guard appears at the door, checks the compartment number against a list, closes the door firmly, and turns a key in the lock from the outside, exactly as company procedure requires him to do on every carriage on this train. Eliza has ridden trains before. She knows, in the abstract, that this is simply how the system works, that the lock is meant to keep passengers from falling or being thrown from a moving train, that it will open again in an hour and a half when they reach the first scheduled stop. Knowing this does very little, in practice, to soften the particular small jolt that passes through her at the sound of the key turning, the unmistakable, mechanical confirmation that for the next stretch of the journey, whatever happens inside this compartment, she has no way whatsoever of leaving it. The engine's whistle sounds somewhere ahead. The platform begins, very slowly, to slide backward past the window, and the evening that this account is about to spend considerable time inside has, for all intents and purposes, already begun. If you picture the inside of a Victorian train, you probably picture something closer to the trains of the 20th century than the one Eliza has just been locked into. A long carriage with a centre aisle, seats facing forward in rows, a corridor a passenger can walk down to stretch their legs or find a lavatory or simply put some distance between themselves and an unpleasant travelling. Companion. That image is not wrong because you invented it. It is wrong because it describes a railway carriage that would not become standard on ordinary British trains for another 2 decades at least, and that in 1875 barely existed anywhere on the network at all. The carriage Eliza is riding in tonight is built on an entirely different principle, one borrowed, quite deliberately, from the horse-drawn road coaches the railway had only recently replaced. Early railway engineers, designing rolling stock for a technology that did not yet have its own visual language, simply bolted several stagecoach bodies together onto a single-wheeled frame and called it a train. That ancestry never fully disappeared. By 1875, the individual stagecoach shape had been absorbed into a longer wooden carriage, but the internal logic remained essentially the same, a series of separate, sealed boxes called compartments, each one seating perhaps 6 to 8 passengers on 2 facing benches, each one entirely self-contained, with no interior door connecting it to the compartment next to it, and no way whatsoever for a passenger to move between them once the train was in motion. A first-class carriage might have 3 or 4 such compartments. A third-class carriage might have more, smaller and plainer, but the basic architecture stayed the same across every class of ticket. You entered your box at the platform. You stayed in your box until the train stopped again. The doors themselves, one on each side of every compartment, opened directly onto the platform or, more alarmingly, directly onto open track when the train was between stations, which is precisely why so many railway companies had adopted the practice of locking them from the outside before departure. The stated purpose, printed in company regulations and repeated in newspaper correspondence throughout the period, was passenger safety, specifically the prevention of people opening a door and stepping out, whether by accident, by drunken misjudgment, or in the small number of documented cases, by deliberate intent, while the train was travelling at speed. A locked door could not swing open on a curve. A locked door could not be opened by a frightened child or a confused elderly passenger reaching for what looked, in the dark, like an exit. The logic was sound as far as it went, and it genuinely did prevent a certain category of accident that had killed and injured passengers on unlocked carriages in the railway's earlier, more improvisational decades. What that same locked door also did, and what the railway companies were considerably less forthcoming about in their public regulations, was remove every ordinary passenger's ability to leave a compartment for any reason at all once the guard had turned his key. For the entire distance between one scheduled stop and the next. On the London and North Western line Eliza is riding tonight, that distance could easily run to an hour or more of uninterrupted travel, sealed inside a wooden box, roughly 7 feet by 6, with whoever else happened to be ticketed into the same compartment, regardless of what happened to any of them in the interval. If a fellow passenger fell suddenly and seriously ill, if a fire broke out from a dropped match or an overturned oil lamp, if one passenger began to behave in a way that frightened or threatened another, there was, for the length of that journey, genuinely nothing to be done about it beyond shouting through a window and hoping someone outside the train happened to hear. For Eliza, sitting across from a man she has never met and knows nothing about, this particular reality announces itself the moment the key turns, and it does not entirely fade for the rest of the evening. She is not, in this specific moment, afraid of him exactly. He has said nothing untoward, done nothing threatening, simply nodded once and returned to his newspaper with the mild, incurious politeness expected of strangers sharing close quarters. But she is aware, in the low, constant way a person is aware of a held breath, of the precise dimensions of the space she is now sealed inside, of the distance to the nearest door that will not open, and of the fact that whatever happens between here and the first scheduled stop, roughly 40 minutes away, will happen without any possibility of outside intervention. She keeps her bag on her lap rather than on the seat beside her. She positions herself, without entirely deciding to, nearer to the window than to her fellow passenger. These are small, almost unconscious adjustments. the kind any experienced female traveller of the period made automatically, and they cost her nothing in comfort. They simply describe, in miniature, exactly how much of her attention this locked door is quietly occupying. The broader context here matters, because the locked compartment was not a minor engineering choice made by one company and ignored by its rivals. It was close to universal across the British railway network through the middle decades of the century. And it persisted for reasons that had as much to do with cost and custom as with genuine safety calculation. A corridor running the length of a carriage, connecting compartment to compartment, required a fundamentally different design of rolling stock, wider carriages, a different seating arrangement, and, just as important, a lavatory or two built into that corridor to make the whole arrangement worth the expense, since a corridor that led nowhere in particular offered a company very little competitive advantage over its rivals. The railway historian Christian Woolmar, whose survey of British railway history traces this exact evolution in careful detail, has described the compartment system as a design inherited more from habit and convenience than from any deliberate reasoning about what passengers actually needed on a 5-hour journey. A system that persisted for decades in part because no single company wanted to bear the cost of changing it first, while its competitors kept charging the same fares for the same cramped, familiar boxes. There is something worth sitting with in how ordinary this all felt to Eliza and to every other passenger boarding a British train in 1875. Nobody in that station tonight is thinking of the locked door as an outrage or even, particularly, as a hardship. It is simply how trains work, the way a modern passenger accepts a narrow airline seat without much active thought. An inconvenience so thoroughly built into the experience of travel that questioning it would have struck most Victorians as faintly eccentric. Every single person boarding this train, first class and third class alike, accepted the same basic arrangement, differing only in the quality of the upholstery on the bench they were locked in beside. Eliza settles her bag more firmly on her lap, watches the last lights of the station slide past the window, and turns her attention, as any sensible traveller would, to the newspaper folded beside her, rather than to a fact of railway design she has had no power to change since the day she was born. Which brings us to the question that nobody in that compartment tonight will say aloud, though every experienced traveller on this train is quietly and privately managing it in exactly the same way Eliza is about to manage it. And that question concerns what happens when a body sealed inside a locked wooden box for an hour or more simply needs, as bodies eventually do, somewhere to go. If you imagine a long train journey in almost any era before living memory, you probably assume, reasonably enough, that the train itself made some accommodation for the most basic of human needs. It did not on an ordinary British train in 1875, and the absence of that accommodation was not an oversight so much as a direct, structural consequence of the very compartment system this account has just spent considerable time describing. A carriage built as a row of sealed boxes, each one entered and exited only from the platform, had no interior space in which to fit a lavatory that any passenger could actually reach without first walking through a locked door onto a moving train. The convenience simply had nowhere to go, architecturally speaking, and so for most of the century it did not exist at all. The actual practice this absence produced was, by any modern standard, remarkable in its bluntness. Passengers on a long journey were expected to wait, sometimes for several hours at a stretch, until the train reached a scheduled station stop, at which point they would disembark, hurry to whatever facilities the platform offered, and reboard before the guard's whistle sounded again, a process that on a busy platform with a train full of similarly desperate passengers could turn into its own small, undignified scramble. Some larger stations offered reasonably adequate facilities. Many smaller ones offered very little, a single outdoor convenience shared by an entire platform's worth of arriving and departing travellers, entirely inadequate to the sudden demand a stopping express train could generate in the space of a 5 or 10 minute halt. And for the interval between those stops, which on a route like the one Eliza is traveling could run well over an hour at a stretch and considerably longer on some express services that prided themselves on minimizing halts altogether. A passenger's options amounted to endurance, private discomfort, and in the accounts that survive from the period, occasional genuine physical distress. Particularly among elderly travelers, pregnant women, and anyone suffering from illness that made waiting a real medical difficulty rather than a simple inconvenience, ladies traveled, when they could arrange it, with a covered chamber vessel discreetly stowed in a handbag or under a seat. A solution period etiquette manuals alluded to only in the most oblique language imaginable, and that many women of Eliza's class found more mortifying to use, in the presence of a stranger sharing the same small compartment, than the discomfort it was meant to relieve. Men had somewhat more latitude, and period accounts describe the occasional passenger relieving himself out of an open window at speed. A practice that was technically against company regulations on most lines, and that solved nothing at all for the women, children, and more reserved travelers who made up a large share of the network's ordinary custom. The gap between what a Victorian train promised, speed, comfort, modern convenience, and what it actually delivered on this particular point, was about as wide as any gap this account has cause to examine, and remarkably, it was a gap almost nobody in polite company discussed in print, because discussing it required using words that Victorian print culture preferred, on the whole, simply to avoid. For Eliza, the first hour of this journey passes without incident on exactly this front, helped along by the fact that she deliberately avoided the tea offered to her at the station buffet before boarding. A small private calculation she has made on every long journey since her very first one as a young governess, learning early and the hard way exactly how much liquid a body could reasonably manage across an unpredictable stretch of locked compartments. It is a minor, practical adjustment, the sort of thing she has stopped consciously thinking about years ago, and it says something quietly damning about the actual experience of Victorian rail travel that an entire generation of women learned, as a matter of ordinary common sense, to manage their own bodies around a transportation system that had simply declined to manage this particular need for them. The broader picture here connects directly to who the railway companies were actually building their trains for. Wealthier travellers on the longest express routes occasionally had access, by the middle of the 1870s, to a small number of specially built saloon carriages, precursors to what would later be marketed as Pullman cars, offering a private lavatory as one of several considerable luxuries available to passengers wealthy enough to book an entire compartment or a specially arranged saloon rather than share an ordinary carriage. These were rare, expensive, and confined to a small number of prestige services rather than anything resembling the ordinary network Eliza is riding tonight. For the overwhelming majority of British rail passengers in 1875, first class included, the lavatory simply did not travel with them. It waited at the next station, whenever the next station happened to arrive. There is something clarifying about knowing this, about understanding that an entire nation of Victorian rail travellers, dignified in their travelling clothes, composed in their travelling manners, were quietly and universally managing exactly the same private discomfort Eliza is managing right now. In silence. Because the alternative was to be the passenger who mentioned it. The definition of an acceptable journey was different than it would become. And critically, everybody sharing every compartment on every train in Britain that November evening was enduring some version of the same weight. The cold, meanwhile, was its own ongoing negotiation, one that started the moment Eliza settled onto the bench seat and did not fully resolve for the rest of the journey. If you imagine a Victorian train carriage in November, you probably picture something reasonably snug, dark wood panelling, a compartment small enough that a handful of bodies and a few oil lamps might warm it the way a small room warms with occupants in it. Perhaps even some early version of the radiator a modern train relies on without a second thought. The truth is closer to the opposite. A mid-Victorian railway carriage had, in the vast majority of cases, no heating system built into its structure at all. No pipe, no stove, no mechanism of any kind for warming the air inside a wooden box that was, by its very design, full of gaps around the doors and windows and constantly exposed, on its underside, to whatever the weather happened to be doing at 50 miles an hour. The solution the railway companies eventually settled on, from around the middle of the century onward, was almost comically low-tech given the sophistication of the machine pulling the train, and it involved a flat metal container, usually made of tin or copper, filled at the terminus with water heated nearly to boiling, and passed into the compartment to be placed on the floor under the passengers' feet. These foot warmers, as they were universally known, were the primary source of heat available to a Victorian rail traveller on a cold journey. Available for a small additional charge on many lines and, on some of the more budget-conscious companies, not available in third-class compartments at all. A passenger fortunate enough to have one tucked under the bench could expect it to provide real, appreciable warmth for perhaps the first hour of a journey. After that, the water inside began to cool, steadily and irreversibly, until by the second or third hour the object doing duty as a foot warmer had become, in practice, simply a cold metal box taking up floor space, offering no more heat than the ashtray beside it. There was no way to refill it mid-journey. There was no way to request a fresh one until the train reached a station equipped to swap them out, which not every station was. A traveller on a long, cold evening service, exactly the kind of journey Eliza is currently undertaking, might reasonably expect to spend the final 2 or 3 hours of a 5-hour trip with cold feet, a cold compartment, and nothing at all to be done about either beyond wrapping herself more tightly in whatever clothing she had thought to bring. Eliza had thought to bring a great deal, because this was a lesson she had learned the same way she had learned to avoid tea before a long journey, through direct and uncomfortable experience rather than any guidance the railway company itself troubled to provide. Beneath her wool cloak she wears a second, lighter shawl folded close against her body, and in her bag, wrapped carefully to avoid creasing, a pair of knitted woolen stockings thick enough to double as a kind of portable insulation for her feet and ankles, an item no fashionable ladies' magazine of the period would have photographed for its readers, and that every experienced female traveller of modest means owned regardless. The foot warmer under her bench had been reasonably hot when the guard placed it there at Euston. By the time the train passes through the outskirts of London, less than half an hour into the journey, she can already feel the specific gradual dulling of its heat through the sole of her boot, a sensation she recognizes immediately and has simply learned, over years of similar journeys, not to react to. The broader context here reveals something quietly telling about how the railway companies understood their own obligation to the passengers riding in their carriages. Heating, unlike locks or timetables, was treated throughout this period as a comfort rather than a necessity, an amenity a company might charge extra for rather than a baseline expectation built into the price of a ticket, and the class stratification of that comfort mapped with brutal precision onto the class stratification of everything else about Victorian rail travel. First and second class passengers could generally count on a foot warmer being provided, though its cooling water still limited how long the comfort actually lasted. Third-class passengers, whose carriages had only stopped being open, roofless wooden trucks within living memory of many of the older travellers riding them, frequently rode without any heating provision whatsoever, relying entirely on the thickness of their own coats and the body heat of the strangers packed in beside them. The historian and living history practitioner Ruth Goodman, whose work reconstructing the physical realities of Victorian daily life has involved actually wearing period clothing through the conditions it was designed for, has written about just how much heavier and more numerous Victorian outer garments needed to be to compensate for buildings, carriages and streets that modern heating and insulation have made almost impossible for a contemporary reader to fully imagine. A Victorian traveller's wardrobe, in other words, was not simply fashion. It was infrastructure, doing quietly and personally what the railway company had declined to do for its passengers on any structural level. There is something worth noticing in how completely this discomfort had become. For Eliza and for every other passenger on this train, simply the unremarkable texture of travel rather than a grievance worth voicing. She does not complain about the cooling foot warmer, does not mention it to the stranger across from her, does not even, particularly, dwell on it in her own thoughts beyond the small, familiar act of drawing her shawl a little closer. It is simply what a long train journey in November felt like. The way waiting for a station lavatory was simply what a long train journey felt like. One more small negotiation her body would carry on quietly for the rest of the evening, while her attention, for the most part, stayed fixed on the darkening window and the countryside sliding past it. The smell alone would tell you something was different about the world beyond that window, and it would tell you before your eyes had fully adjusted to what was producing it. If you imagine the sensory experience of a steam train in motion, you probably picture something close to what illustrated Victorian advertisements were eager to sell. A plume of white steam trailing gracefully behind an elegant engine. More atmosphere than hazard. The sort of image that still decorates greeting cards and nostalgia calendars more than a century later. The reality, for anyone actually riding behind that engine with a window open, was considerably less picturesque. The locomotive pulling Eliza's train burns coal, a great deal of it, in a firebox that sends a continuous stream of hot gas, ash, and partially combusted fuel up through its chimney and directly into the slipstream of air rushing past every carriage behind it. Some of what came out of that chimney was still, visibly, on fire. Passengers who chose, understandably, to open a window for fresh air on a long journey, or who simply could not avoid a gap in a poorly sealed frame, took on a specific and well-documented risk in doing so, because glowing cinders and sparks thrown from the smokestack travelled easily into an open compartment, carried on the same wind the train itself was generating. Victorian newspapers of the period carried a steady, recurring stream of small notices describing exactly this hazard in its most immediate and physical form. A lady's shawl catching alight from a stray ember, a gentleman's coat sleeve smouldering before he or a fellow passenger managed to beat it out. Hair singed, upholstery scorched. In incidents ranging from minor and merely alarming to seriously dangerous, depending on how quickly the fire was noticed and how confined the space around it happened to be, which, given the design of the compartment carriage this account has already spent considerable time describing, was very confined indeed. Railway companies fitted their locomotives with devices called spark arresters, wire mesh screens designed to catch the largest embers before they escaped the chimney entirely, and engineering across the period gradually improved the effectiveness of these devices. They did not eliminate the problem. A locomotive working hard up an incline, its fire built high to generate maximum power, threw more sparks than one idling gently along level track, and no amount of mesh screening fully solved a hazard that was, in the end, a direct consequence of burning coal at speed a few dozen feet from a passenger's open window. Tunnels presented their own distinct version of the same underlying problem, and arguably a worse one. A locomotive travelling through a tunnel had nowhere for its smoke to disperse, no open sky to rise into, and the exhaust that would ordinarily trail away behind an engine in open country instead filled the tunnel bore itself, thick and acrid, before pouring directly into any compartment whose window had been left open or whose seals had worn thin with age. Passengers on longer tunnel routes described the experience in terms that modern travellers would find deeply distressing, a sudden plunge into total darkness accompanied by the abrupt, overwhelming smell of coal smoke, eyes stinging, throats catching, sometimes for a minute or more depending on the tunnel's length and the train's speed through it, before the carriage emerged back into daylight and clean air. Experienced travellers learned, exactly the way Eliza had learned to manage her tea and her stockings, to close a window firmly before a known tunnel approached, and to warn a less experienced companion to do the same, a small ritual of preparation that appears in period accounts and guidebooks with striking consistency. Eliza herself performs this ritual without needing to think about it, closing the window at her shoulder as the train approaches a cutting she recognizes from previous journeys along this line. moments before the carriage plunges into darkness, and the particular, familiar smell of hot iron and burning coal fills the sealed compartment anyway, seeping in through gaps the closed window cannot fully block. The stranger across from her, evidently less familiar with this stretch of track, coughs once, sharply, and presses a handkerchief to his mouth, and Eliza allows herself the smallest private satisfaction of having anticipated what he had not. It is one of the few moments in the entire journey where her experience, rather than her vulnerability, gives her something like the advantage. The broader picture connects this specific discomfort to a genuine, ongoing engineering problem that railway companies across Britain spent decades trying to solve without ever fully succeeding. Because the underlying physics of burning coal to generate steam at speed did not leave a great deal of room for a truly clean solution using the technology available in 1875. Improvements did come. Gradually, spark arrestor design grew more sophisticated. Some companies experimented with alternative fuels and firebox designs that reduced the worst of the emissions. And later decades would see genuine progress on this front as engineering matured. None of that progress had arrived yet for Eliza, riding a fairly ordinary express service on a fairly ordinary November evening, breathing air that would have registered to a modern passenger's lungs as something closer to standing near a bonfire than sitting in a train carriage. There is something worth pausing on in how thoroughly the Victorians had normalized breathing this particular air, coughing through this particular smoke, checking a companion's coat sleeve for a stray ember the way a modern traveller checks a seatbelt. It was not, to anyone riding that train, an emergency. It was simply the texture of speed, the specific price a body paid, in soot on its collar and smoke in its lungs, for travelling faster than any generation before it had ever travelled. The engine did what the era had asked it to do, and asked, in return, that every passenger behind it learn to live with what came out of its chimney. If the smoke and the cold were physical hazards a body could at least prepare for with a closed window or a second shawl, the stranger sitting across the compartment from Eliza was a different kind of risk altogether, one no amount of preparation could fully answer. Because the entire architecture of the carriage had already decided, before she ever boarded, that she would spend this journey locked into a small wooden room with whoever happened to hold a ticket for the same seats. If you imagine sharing a train compartment with a stranger in the Victorian period, you probably picture something mildly awkward at worst. A polite nod, perhaps some stilted conversation about the weather, both parties retreating gratefully into their own newspapers within a few minutes. For the great majority of journeys, across the great majority of the network, that mild awkwardness was indeed the full extent of it, and most Victorian rail travel passed exactly as uneventfully as most rail travel does today. But the design of the compartment carriage created a specific vulnerability that a polite nod could do nothing to solve. Because once that door was locked, there was no conductor walking the length of the train to check on passengers. No corridor a frightened traveller could use to move to a different compartment, and no mechanism whatsoever for leaving a compartment that had, for whatever reason, become a place a passenger no longer wished to be. For women travelling without a male escort, a situation that was becoming steadily more common by 1875 as employment, family circumstance and simple economic necessity sent unmarried and widowed women like Eliza across the country in growing numbers, this vulnerability was not an abstract, theoretical concern. Victorian newspapers and court records preserve a genuine, recurring pattern of complaints from women who found themselves alone in a locked compartment with a man who made unwanted advances, offered unwelcome conversation that would not stop, or in a smaller number of more serious cases, behaved in ways that crossed clearly into assault. All of it occurring in a space from which the victim had no physical means of escape and no way to summon help until the train next stopped, by which point considerable harm might already have been done. Etiquette manuals of the period addressed the problem obliquely, the way Victorian print culture addressed most bodily and physical dangers, advising women to seek out compartments already occupied by other women or families rather than travel in a compartment with a single, unaccompanied man, to sit as near to the corridor connecting door as the carriage allowed, which on most trains meant nothing more than sitting nearer the locked exit itself, and to dress and comport themselves in ways calculated to discourage familiarity. None of this advice addressed the structural problem underneath it, which was that a woman travelling alone on an ordinary British train in 1875 had, once that door was locked, essentially no recourse at all if the stranger across from her decided to behave badly, beyond her own wits, her own nerve, and whatever small object of self-defense she had thought to carry. Eliza carries exactly such an object. A long steel hatpin secured through the crown of her bonnet, sharpened rather more deliberately than fashion strictly required. A small and almost universal precaution among women of her class and generation who travelled alone with any regularity. She has never used it. She hopes, as she has hoped on every similar journey before this one, that she will never need to. But its presence, and her awareness of exactly how quickly she could reach it if the need arose, forms part of the same quiet, constant calculation she has been running since the moment the guard's key turned in the lock. The seating position chosen nearer the window, the bag kept close rather than set aside. The level, unremarkable tone she has maintained in the 2 or 3 polite exchanges she and the stranger across from her have shared since Euston. He has given her, so far, no reason at all for alarm. He asked 20 minutes into the journey whether the draught from the window troubled her and closed it slightly at her nod, a small and entirely ordinary courtesy. And yet the vigilance does not switch off simply because the evidence so far has been reassuring, because Eliza, like every experienced female traveller of her era, has learned that reassurance and safety are not, in a locked compartment, quite the same thing. The broader context matters considerably here, because this specific anxiety was not simply a matter of individual nerves or an overactive imagination on the part of Victorian women. It reflected a genuine, structural gap in how the railway companies had designed their carriages, one that social historians of the period, among them Judith Flanders in her wide-ranging studies of Victorian domestic and public life, have identified as a real and largely unaddressed source of danger for women navigating an increasingly mobile, industrial society that had not yet built the safeguards to match the new freedoms it was offering them. Women were travelling further, more often, and more independently than any previous generation of British women had travelled, taking up positions exactly like the one waiting for Eliza outside Manchester, visiting families scattered by industrial migration, managing business and family affairs their mothers would rarely have undertaken alone. The railway made all of that mobility possible. It did comparatively little to make that mobility safe, and the gap between the two sat, largely unacknowledged in official company literature, at the centre of a great many women's private calculations every time they boarded a train alone. There is something clarifying about recognizing how much of this labour was invisible, carried out silently by women like Eliza in every locked compartment on every train in Britain, never mentioned in the timetables or the advertisements, rarely discussed in mixed company, and yet present in some form in the mind of nearly every woman travelling without an escort on that November evening. It was not paranoia. It was a rational response to a genuine structural condition, refined over years of experience into the kind of quiet, practiced vigilance that looked, to any casual observer glancing into the compartment, like nothing more than a composed woman reading her newspaper in comfortable silence. That particular fear, the fear of being trapped in a locked compartment with a stranger who meant real harm, was not an abstraction dreamed up by anxious mothers and cautious etiquette writers. It had a specific, well-documented origin, a single crime that had occurred 11 years before this exact journey and that had changed, permanently and measurably, how an entire nation thought about the simple act of sharing a railway carriage. On the night of the 9th of July, 1864, a 69-year-old bank clerk named Thomas Briggs boarded a first-class compartment on the North London Railway at Fenchurch Street Station, heading home after an evening spent visiting relatives, a short, unremarkable journey he had made many times before along a line that ran through the eastern edges of London toward his home in Hackney. Briggs was a senior, respected employee of the banking house Robarts, Curtis and Company, a man of settled habits and modest but genuine prosperity, the kind of passenger the railway companies were proud to count among their regular first-class custom. He boarded alone. He was found, roughly 20 minutes later, by two bank clerks who entered the same compartment at the next stop, expecting to continue their own journey. And what they found instead was blood pooled thickly across the seat cushions and floor, with no passenger anywhere inside. Briggs himself was discovered shortly afterward by the crew of a train travelling in the opposite direction, lying beside the tracks between Bow and Hackney Wick stations, alive but grievously injured, his skull fractured in what investigators would determine were multiple blows from a heavy object, his body apparently thrown or pushed from the moving train. He was carried to a nearby public house, attended by doctors summoned urgently to the scene, and died the following day without ever regaining sufficient consciousness to describe what had happened to him. His gold watch and its chain were missing. His hat, a distinctive top hat, was also gone, and in its place, left behind on the seat of the blood-soaked compartment, was a different hat entirely. A black one that had been altered, cut down and reshaped, apparently by someone attempting to make it fit a head smaller than his own. The murder produced an immediate and genuinely national panic out of proportion, in the strictest statistical sense, to the actual rarity of the crime, but entirely understandable given what it revealed about the fundamental architecture of the railway carriage itself. Briggs had been murdered, robbed, and thrown from a moving train inside a locked compartment on an ordinary evening journey by an assailant who had simply shared the same enclosed space with him and who had, once the act was done, faced no locked door, no corridor, no fellow passenger, nothing at all standing between the crime and its completion beyond whatever chance discovery eventually followed. Newspapers across the country carried the story for weeks. Passengers, gripped by an anxiety that would have struck an observer from an earlier decade as wildly excessive, began carrying weapons, revolvers among the wealthier classes, sturdier walking sticks and hatpins among those with fewer resources, into compartments they had previously boarded without a second thought. The essential, unremarkable act of sitting across from a stranger on a train, performed by millions of British passengers every week without incident, had suddenly and permanently acquired a shadow it would never entirely lose. The investigation that followed became in its own right one of the most closely followed criminal cases of the entire Victorian period. A cab driver named Jonathan Matthews, reading newspaper descriptions of the stolen watch chain, recognized it as a gift he had recently received from an acquaintance, a young German tailor named Franz Müller, for his own daughter, and came forward to police with information that would ultimately break the case wide open. Investigators traced Muller's recent movements and discovered that he had booked passage days after the murder aboard a slow-sailing vessel bound for New York named the Victoria, apparently attempting to put an ocean between himself and a crime that had by then become the most talked about murder investigation in Britain. Detectives, along with the cab driver and a jeweler who could identify the altered hat, pursued him aboard a considerably faster steamship, arriving in New York well ahead of Muller's own slower vessel and waiting for him to disembark directly into the arms of the law. Muller was arrested the moment he stepped off the Victoria, extradited back to England under intense public scrutiny, and tried at the Old Bailey in the autumn of 1864 in a trial that filled newspaper columns for weeks and drew enormous crowds to the courthouse itself. He maintained his innocence throughout, and the evidence against him, while ultimately convincing to the jury, was almost entirely circumstantial, built from the watch chain, the altered hat, witnesses who placed him near Briggs on the platform at Fenchurch Street, and the simple, damning fact of his flight to America immediately after the murder. He was convicted and sentenced to death, and on the 14th of November 1864 he was hanged outside Newgate Prison before one of the largest and most notoriously unruly crowds ever assembled for a public execution in England. A crowd whose drunken, carnival-like behavior that morning became its own minor scandal and contributed, in the years that followed, to the growing movement to abolish public executions altogether, a change Parliament would enact only a few years later. For Eliza, sitting in her own locked compartment 11 years after Briggs was murdered in one very much like it, the case remains, as it remained for nearly every regular rail traveller of her generation, something closer to living memory than distant history. She would have been a girl of 21 when the trial filled the newspapers, old enough to read every detail, old enough to understand exactly what it meant for a respectable woman contemplating a future of independent travel. The particular vigilance she carries into every compartment she boards, the hatpin secured just so, the seat chosen with half-conscious care, the quiet, constant tracking of a stranger's hands and posture that she would never think to describe to anyone as fear exactly. All of it traces back, whether she consciously names the connection or not, to a single blood-soaked compartment on the North London Railway and the young tailor who was hanged for what happened inside it. There is something worth sitting with in how completely one crime, statistically rare against the millions of uneventful journeys taken every year across the British rail network, had managed to reshape an entire nation's relationship with an ordinary, everyday act. The locked compartment had always carried this risk structurally from the very first year the design was adopted. It took one specific, horrifying case, reported in exhaustive detail and followed obsessively by a public that had never before had reason to think carefully about what a locked door on a moving train actually meant, to make that risk impossible to ignore. Briggs did not create the danger. He simply, and at the cost of his own life, made it visible. Now, the response. Because the Briggs murder did not simply terrify the travelling public and then fade, the way a lesser sensation might have faded within a season or two. It forced Parliament and the railway companies into a reform they had spent years quietly avoiding, one that would define the experience of nearly every British rail passenger for the following quarter century, Eliza included. If you assume that a Victorian train, once the Briggs case had exposed the danger of a fully sealed compartment, was quickly fitted with some reliable means for a passenger to summon help, you are only partly right, and the part where you are wrong reveals a great deal about how reluctantly Victorian railway companies moved on questions of passenger safety when the fix in question cost money. Parliament did act, comparatively swiftly by the standards of Victorian legislation, passing the Regulation of Railways Act of 1868, which required companies to provide some means of communication between passengers and railway staff on trains travelling significant distances without stopping, on lines where the old compartment design offered no corridor connection between carriages. This was, on paper, a direct and reasonable response to exactly the vulnerability the Briggs case had exposed. In practice, the mechanism the companies actually installed to satisfy that requirement was considerably less reassuring than the law's language suggested. The device most commonly adopted became known simply as the communication cord, a length of cord or wire strung along the outside of the carriages, or in some early and even less workable designs, threaded through metal rings mounted above the compartment windows, connected at its far end to a bell, a gong, or a small disc visible to the guard riding in his own separate compartment or van somewhere along the length of the train. A passenger in genuine distress was meant to reach for this cord, usually by leaning out of the window to grasp it, and pull, triggering a signal the guard would supposedly notice and act upon. The flaws in this arrangement were numerous and, in retrospect, almost embarrassingly obvious. Reaching the cord in many early installations required a passenger to physically extend an arm outside a moving train, a maneuver that was itself hazardous and considerably more difficult for a passenger already being attacked or otherwise incapacitated than the calm illustrations in company literature ever suggested. Even when the signal successfully reached the guard, he had no way to stop the train instantly himself. No direct mechanical connection to the engine's brakes on most services of this period, meaning he could do little more than signal forward to the driver by whatever slow, imperfect method the specific line had adopted. A process that could easily consume several minutes on a train traveling at considerable speed. More than enough time for whatever emergency had triggered the cord to run its full and terrible course. Some companies, in the years immediately following the Briggs case, adopted a smaller and cheaper supplementary measure, cutting a small glazed peephole into the partition between adjoining compartments, just large enough for a guard walking along the carriage's external footboard at a station stop to glance through and confirm that all was well inside. These little windows acquired a grim, informal nickname among the travelling public that persisted for years afterward, remembered simply as Muller's lights, a permanent physical reminder built into the very fabric of the carriage of exactly what had made them necessary. They allowed a guard to check on a compartment's occupants when the train was stationary. They did nothing whatsoever to help a passenger in the middle of an emergency between stations, which had been the entire specific horror of the Briggs case in the first place. Eliza has ridden trains fitted with both of these measures for years, and she understands their limitations with the same clear-eyed practicality she brings to her tea and her stockings and her hatpin. She locates the cord near her window without needing to search for it, a habit so ingrained she barely registers doing it, and she has, on exactly one occasion years earlier, actually pulled it when a fellow passenger in a different compartment on a different journey collapsed from what turned out to be a fainting spell rather than anything more sinister. The bell rang. The guard, eventually, appeared at the next scheduled stop, roughly 11 minutes later by her own private count at the time. An interval she remembers precisely because she spent every second of it acutely aware of exactly how long 11 minutes actually is when a stranger beside you needs help and you have no way to reach anyone faster. She does not mention this memory to the man across from her tonight. She simply notes, as she has noted on every journey since, the location of the cord, the approximate distance to the next scheduled stop, and the plain, unglamorous fact that if anything did happen between here and Manchester, help would arrive considerably more slowly than the company's own reassuring literature implied. The broader picture reveals a pattern that runs through nearly every safety reform this account has occasion to discuss, in which railway companies, protective of both their profits and their reputations, tended to adopt the cheapest technically compliant solution to any legally mandated improvement, rather than the most effective one. A full corridor system, connecting every compartment along the length of a carriage and allowing a guard, or indeed any passenger, to move freely and check on trouble the moment it arose, would have solved the underlying problem far more completely than any cord or peephole ever could. It would also have required rebuilding the entire national fleet of passenger carriages at a cost most companies were simply unwilling to bear, while a cheaper, legally sufficient alternative existed. The railway historian Christian Woolmar has traced this exact reluctance across decades of British railway history, noting how consistently company boards prioritised the minimum expenditure required to satisfy Parliament over the more thorough safety investment that passengers themselves, judging from newspaper correspondence of the period, were frequently and vocally demanding. It would take until the very final years of the 19th century for corridor carriages, complete with connecting vestibules and onboard lavatories, to become the ordinary standard on British express services, a change driven, in the end, less by any single technical breakthrough than by the sustained, cumulative weight of exactly the kind of public fear the Briggs case had first ignited more than 2 decades earlier. There is something worth sitting with in how long that gap actually was, more than 20 years between the crime that proved the compartment system dangerous and the arrival of a design that meaningfully addressed the danger. 20 years during which Eliza and millions of passengers like her simply continued boarding locked compartments, checking for the nearest cord, and trusting to luck and their own vigilance for the length of every journey they undertook. The cord was real. It was also, in the moment it actually mattered most, closer to a formality than a genuine safeguard, and everybody who used the railways in 1875 understood this. In the same quiet, unspoken way, they understood the limits of the foot warmer and the futility of asking a locked door to open before its scheduled hour. Close your eyes for a moment and consider what happens to a wooden box traveling at 50 miles an hour when the rails beneath it are simply, suddenly, no longer there. If you imagine a Victorian train derailment, you probably picture something survivable: a rough jolt, a spilled tea tray, passengers thrown from their seats, but largely uninjured, the kind of dramatic but ultimately minor mishap that period illustrations sometimes rendered with more excitement than horror. The engineering reality of what actually happened when a mid-Victorian train left its tracks was considerably grimmer, and it traced directly back to the same wooden construction that made every other hazard in this account possible in the first place. A Victorian railway carriage was built primarily from timber, its frame strengthened with iron, but its body, walls, and roof still overwhelmingly wood, a material chosen for cost and workability that offered almost none of the structural integrity a modern steel carriage provides in a collision. When a derailment sent one carriage crashing into the back of another, or when a train left the rails entirely and its carriages piled into each other at speed, the wooden bodies did not absorb the impact so much as they simply failed, splintering, buckling, and in the worst documented cases, driving one carriage bodily into the compartment ahead of it in a phenomenon railway engineers of the period grimly termed telescoping. The rear carriage's frame punching directly through the wooden walls of the one in front like a blade through a matchbox. The injuries this produced bore little resemblance to the spilled tea tray of popular imagination. Passengers trapped in a telescoped compartment faced crush injuries of the most severe kind. Limbs and torsos caught between collapsing timber frames with a force no Victorian rescue worker, arriving with hand tools and lanterns rather than any of the specialized equipment a modern emergency service would deploy, could always free them from quickly enough. Newspaper accounts of serious derailments throughout this period, and there were a great many of them across the third quarter of the 19th century as Britain's rapidly expanding rail network strained against track, signalling and maintenance standards that had not always kept pace with the speed and traffic volume the companies were pushing through it. Describe scenes of genuine devastation. Splintered wood, trapped and dying passengers, and rescue efforts hampered by darkness, distance from help, and the sheer physical difficulty of extracting a body from a collapsed wooden frame using little more than axes and bare hands. One crash in particular had, by 1875, become a byword for exactly this kind of disaster. Not because it was the deadliest derailment of the period, though its death toll was severe enough on its own, but because one of its survivors happened to be the most famous writer in England. On the 9th of June 1865, a boat train of the South Eastern Railway, carrying passengers from the Folkestone ferry toward London, approached a viaduct near the Kent village of Staplehurst, where maintenance workers had removed a section of rail for repair, the foreman on site having consulted the wrong timetable and expecting a considerably later train than the one now bearing down on the gap at speed. The locomotive itself managed to leap the missing section of track. Most of the carriages behind it did not, derailing violently and, in several cases, plunging from the viaduct into the shallow riverbed below. 10 passengers were killed, dozens more were seriously injured, in scenes of exactly the splintered, crushing devastation this account has just described. Charles Dickens was riding in one of the carriages that derailed but did not fall completely from the viaduct, left tilted at a dangerous angle above the wreckage below. He climbed free, and rather than seeking his own safety, spent the following hours moving through the wreckage, helping tend to the dying and the injured, an act of genuine courage that his own later letters describe in vivid, harrowing detail, including his effort to comfort passengers he knew could not be saved. Before leaving the scene, he also climbed back into the precarious, tilted carriage to retrieve the manuscript pages of the novel he was then writing, Our Mutual Friend, an act that has struck generations of readers since as a strange but very human detail amid so much horror. Dickens survived physically uninjured. He did not, by his own account and by the observations of those closest to him, ever fully recover psychologically. His letters in the years that followed describe recurring episodes of what he called a general shattering of his nerves, sudden and disproportionate waves of terror while travelling, even in an ordinary carriage or cab, that he had never experienced before Staplehurst, and he became noticeably more reluctant to travel by rail at all in his remaining years. He died on the 9th of June 1870, 5 years to the day after the crash. A coincidence that struck his contemporaries as significant enough to record, and that historians of his life have continued to note ever since. For Eliza, riding a considerably more mundane express through the Midlands a full decade after Staplehurst, that crash exists in something like the same living memory as the Briggs murder, another name and date that any regular rail traveller of her generation could recite without prompting, another piece of evidence, quietly filed away, of exactly what could happen to a wooden carriage travelling at speed when the ordinary mechanics of the journey failed. She does not think about it constantly. She is not, tonight, in any particular state of alarm about the state of the track ahead of her. But she is aware, in the same low background register as her awareness of the stranger across from her and the cooling foot warmer beneath her feet, that the wooden walls surrounding her right now offer considerably less protection than their solid, respectable appearance suggests, and that the entire remarkable speed of this journey rests on a foundation of track, points, and signals that a great many educated Victorians had, by 1875, learned not to trust quite as completely as the railway companies would have preferred. The broader context matters here because derailments and collisions during this period were not rare, freak events so much as a recurring, statistically documented feature of a rail network still working out, through repeated and often deadly trial and error, exactly what level of maintenance, inspection, and engineering redundancy its rapidly expanding mileage actually required. Track that had been perfectly adequate for the lighter, slower trains of an earlier decade sometimes proved dangerously inadequate for the heavier, faster services running over it by the 1870s. Points and signals, still largely operated by hand and dependent on human judgment at every stage, failed with a regularity that a modern passenger, accustomed to automated and redundant safety systems, would find deeply alarming. Reform was coming gradually through parliamentary pressure and the accumulating weight of exactly the kind of public horror that crashes like Staplehurst generated. But it was coming slowly, and it would take further disasters, further inquiries, and further decades before the British rail network approached anything resembling the level of structural safety a later traveller would simply take for granted. There is something quietly sobering in recognising that the wooden box carrying Eliza toward Manchester tonight was, by any honest engineering assessment, only as safe as the maintenance crew who had last inspected this stretch of track, the signalman managing traffic through the junctions ahead, and a considerable measure of ordinary, uncelebrated luck. She rides on regardless, because riding on regardless was, in the end, the only real choice available to anyone who needed to travel any meaningful distance in 1875. The alternative, the stagecoach her grandmother had known, carried its own older catalogue of dangers and carried them at a fraction of the speed. Progress, in the shape this particular decade had given it, simply did not come without a price attached, and the wooden walls of every carriage on this train were, in their own quiet way, a constant reminder of exactly what that price could be. For Eliza, none of this, the locked door, the missing lavatory, the cooling foot warmer, the stranger's unreadable intentions, the wooden walls that might or might not hold if the worst happened, was actually the thing she found herself thinking about as the train slowed. Unexpectedly and without explanation, somewhere past Rugby. It was the two men she could not see at all, stationed somewhere out in the dark ahead of her, whose judgment, in that particular moment, mattered rather more to her survival than her own. If you imagine the person responsible for keeping a Victorian train safely apart from every other train on the same stretch of line, You probably picture something like a modern air traffic controller, alert, well-rested, working manageable shifts with proper relief on hand the moment fatigue became a genuine concern. The Victorian signalman, standing watch in a small wooden or brick cabin beside the track, operating the levers that controlled the signals and, on many lines, the points that physically directed a train from one track to another, bore almost no resemblance to that reassuring picture, and the gap between the two was one of the more quietly dangerous features of the entire railway system Eliza was travelling through tonight. Signalmen in this period worked shifts that, by any modern labour standard, verged on the punishing. 12-hour shifts were common on many lines, and when a colleague fell ill, missed a turn, or simply could not be found to relieve the man on duty, that shift could stretch considerably longer, into 18, 24, or in some of the more extreme and later well-documented cases, well over 30 hours of continuous duty, alone in a small cabin, responsible for the lives of every passenger on every train passing his post, with nothing but his own alertness standing between an ordinary, uneventful evening and a catastrophic collision. Railway companies, keeping signal boxes staffed at the lowest cost their budgets would permit, were often slow to hire adequate relief staff, and the culture of the era, which prized endurance and discouraged complaint among working men in a way that made reporting exhaustion feel, to many signalmen, like an admission of weakness rather than a legitimate safety concern, did little to correct the imbalance from below. The consequences of this arrangement showed up with grim regularity in the Board of Trade's own accident investigations throughout the period. Conducted by a small corps of railway inspectors, several of them former military engineers such as Captain Henry Tyler, whose published reports on the causes of specific collisions became, over the following decades, a remarkable and largely unintentional archive of exactly how a tired man's small, understandable errors could cascade into disaster. A signalman who had been awake for 20 hours might misread a train order, might forget momentarily which of several approaching services he had already cleared through a junction, might simply nod, for a matter of seconds, at exactly the moment two trains were converging on the same short stretch of track from opposite directions. The result, when it went wrong, was a head-on collision at combined speeds that could exceed 60 or 70 miles an hour. Two wooden trains meeting each other with a violence that made the derailments this account has already described look almost survivable by comparison, since a derailment at least sent its carriages off in a single direction rather than into each other from both ends at once. Eliza does not know the name of the signalman responsible for the junction her train is currently, mysteriously, slowing to pass through, and she has no way of knowing whether he has been on duty for 2 hours or 20. What she notices, from her seat, is simply the unscheduled deceleration itself. The small, wordless tension that passes through an experienced traveller's body whenever a train behaves in a way its timetable did not predict, and the brief, sidelong glance she exchanges with the stranger across from her. The first moment of genuine, shared feeling either of them has shown the other since Euston. He leans slightly toward the window, peering out into the dark for some sign of what has caused the delay. She does the same. Neither of them says anything. The train, after perhaps 90 seconds of reduced speed, resumes its ordinary pace, and whatever brief hesitation the signal ahead had required of it passes without further incident. One of the countless small, unremarked moments of quiet competence that carried the overwhelming majority of Victorian rail journeys safely to their destination every single day. A fact this account has not spent nearly as much time on as it has spent on the exceptions, though the exceptions were never the whole story. The broader context here matters because the human cost of signalmen's exhausting schedules extended well beyond the passengers riding the trains they controlled. The men themselves bore an enormous, largely uncompensated psychological weight, carrying the knowledge that a single lapse in concentration, brought on by nothing more sinister than ordinary human tiredness, could end dozens of lives in a matter of seconds. A burden period accounts describe taking a genuine and sometimes visible toll on the mental health of men who held these positions for years at a stretch. Parliamentary pressure to address the underlying problem, hours of labour, adequate staffing, mandatory rest periods, built gradually across the final decades of the century, driven by the accumulating weight of accident inquiries that kept identifying the same root cause in report after report. It would take further, more catastrophic disasters, including a devastating collision at Armagh in Ireland in 1889, when a runaway train carrying a Sunday school excursion rolled backward down a hill and collided with a following service, killing roughly 80 passengers, many of them children, to finally force Parliament's hand on a broader package of safety reforms. The Regulation of Railways Act of that same year, which mandated continuous automatic brakes on passenger trains, proper block signalling to keep trains safely separated, and interlocking systems that physically prevented a signalman from clearing conflicting routes even if his own tired judgment failed him. None of that reform had arrived yet in 1875. Eliza's safety tonight rests, as it rested for every passenger on every British train of this decade, on the simple, unassisted vigilance of men working hours that would strike a modern observer as an active invitation to exactly the kind of tragedy the system was ostensibly designed to prevent. There is something worth sitting with in how much of Victorian rail safety depended, in the end, not on engineering redundancy or institutional safeguard, but on the raw, unsupported endurance of individual working men. The signalman awake in his lonely cabin, the driver watching the track ahead through smoke and darkness, each one carrying a responsibility that modern systems would spread across multiple layers of automated protection. The trains ran, overwhelmingly, without incident, night after night, because these men were, for the most part, remarkably good at their jobs even under punishing conditions. But the margin for error was thinner than any passenger boarding at Euston that evening had any real cause to appreciate, and it would take a great many more names added to a great many more accident reports before Parliament finally accepted that endurance alone, however admirable, was never going to be an adequate substitute for a properly engineered safeguard. There is one more danger this account has not yet named, and it is the strangest of all the hazards a Victorian rail traveller carried home with them, because it left no blood on the compartment seat and no splintered wood behind it. And for years the doctors examining it could not entirely agree on whether it was a wound of the body or a wound of the mind, or whether that distinction even made sense for an injury caused by nothing more visible than the shaking of a train. If you imagine surviving a Victorian rail accident, walking away from a derailment or a collision with no broken bones, no visible cuts, nothing a doctor's eye could immediately identify as an injury, you would probably assume, reasonably enough by the standards of any earlier medical understanding, that you had escaped essentially unharmed. A great many Victorian doctors assumed exactly the same thing, at first, and a great many Victorian passengers who survived accidents just like the ones described in this account discovered, in the weeks and months that followed, that the assumption was wrong in ways nobody around them fully understood yet. The condition first attracted serious medical attention in the 1860s as railway accidents multiplied alongside the network's rapid expansion, and as passengers who had survived crashes without obvious physical wounds began presenting, sometimes months after the event, with a truly baffling collection of symptoms: chronic pain along the spine and neck, persistent headaches, tremors, unexplained fatigue, disturbed sleep, a kind of nervous exhaustion that left previously vigorous men and women unable to work, unable to concentrate, unable to explain to their own families exactly what felt so fundamentally wrong with them when nothing on the surface of their bodies looked wrong at all. The surgeon John Eric Ericsson, a respected figure at University College London, took these cases seriously enough to make them the subject of a series of published lectures in 1866, later collected into a book that gave the condition its lasting popular name. He proposed that the violent jolting of a collision, even without any direct blow to a passenger's body, could produce a genuine physical injury to the spinal cord itself, a kind of concussion transmitted through the nervous system by the sheer mechanical shock of the accident, and the public and the popular press seized on the term almost immediately. Railway spine, as Ericsson's diagnosis came to be known, entered the Victorian vocabulary as both a recognized medical condition and, before very long, a subject of considerable and increasingly bitter dispute. The dispute arose, in large part, because railway spine did not remain a purely medical question for very long. British law of the period allowed passengers injured in railway accidents to sue the companies responsible for compensation, and a diagnosis of railway spine, with its promise of a genuine physiological injury lurking somewhere in the nervous system, however invisible to any examination available at the time, became a central and hotly contested feature of an enormous number of these lawsuits. Railway companies facing potentially ruinous financial exposure if every passenger who felt unwell after even a minor accident could claim substantial damages for an injury no doctor could actually see or measure, retained their own medical experts to challenge Ericsson's diagnosis directly, and the resulting professional argument played out for decades across medical journals. Courtroom testimony, and popular newspaper coverage that most literate Victorians would have encountered in one form or another. The most influential of these challengers was a surgeon named Herbert William Page, closely associated with the London and North Western Railway, the very same company whose train Eliza is riding tonight, who published his own extensive study of the condition in 1883, arguing that the great majority of what Ericsson had diagnosed as physical spinal injury was in fact a nervous or psychological reaction to the terror of the accident itself, rather than any measurable physical damage to the spinal cord. Page's argument was not without genuine medical insight, and in retrospect, his instinct that the mind itself could produce real, disabling physical symptoms in response to overwhelming shock and fear anticipated, by several decades, ideas that would eventually become central to modern trauma medicine. But in the specific context of a courtroom where a railway company's own physician was arguing that an injured passenger's suffering was essentially imagined or exaggerated rather than physically real, Page's theory served a second, less noble purpose as well, providing companies with a medically credentialed basis for disputing claims and casting suspicion on claimants, particularly women, whose symptoms were dismissed with troubling frequency as hysteria or nervous weakness rather than legitimate injury. A gendered double standard that ran through a great deal of Victorian medicine well beyond this one specific condition. Charles Dickens himself, in the years following Staplehurst, described symptoms that later physicians and biographers alike have recognized as falling squarely within this same contested territory: the shattered nerves, the sudden waves of terror while traveling, the reluctance to board a train at all that had never troubled him before the crash. Nobody in 1865 or 1866 had a settled, agreed-upon name for what Dickens was experiencing. Caught as it was between Ericsson's physical spine and Page's nervous shock, and the uncertainty itself was part of the suffering, a truly disabling condition that the medical establishment of the day could not fully explain even to the people living through it. Eliza carries no such visible or diagnosed injury tonight, and the overwhelming majority of her fellow passengers on this train will complete their journeys with nothing worse than cold feet and soot on their gloves to show for it. But she has heard the term railway spine spoken of, the way any regular traveller of her generation had heard it spoken of, usually in connection with a relative or an acquaintance of an acquaintance who had survived some accident or near miss and had never, in the years since, quite returned to their former self, complaining of headaches or a persistent, nameless unease around trains that struck those who had not experienced it as faintly embarrassing to discuss openly. She thinks of it now, briefly, as the train resumes its ordinary speed following the unexplained slowing at the junction, a small passing awareness of exactly how thin the line could be between an uneventful journey and one that left a mark no doctor of her era could fully name or heal. The broader context here connects this specific medical controversy to something larger about how the entire Victorian period was still learning to understand the relationship between the mind and the body, a relationship the railway accident, with its unprecedented combination of violent mechanical force and sudden overwhelming terror, forced into public view in a way few earlier experiences had. Historians of medicine studying this exact controversy, including scholars who have traced its influence forward into the 20th century's eventual recognition of shell shock and, later still, post-traumatic stress, have identified railway spine as an important and largely overlooked early chapter in the long, difficult history of medicine, coming to terms with psychological trauma as a real, physically disabling condition rather than a failure of character or a symptom of weakness. Erickson was not entirely right. Page was not entirely wrong. And the passengers caught between their competing theories, suffering real and often lasting symptoms that neither doctor could fully explain, were left to navigate a condition that medicine would not have adequate language for until long after most of them were dead. There is something quietly moving in recognizing that the railway, for all its speed and modernity, had inadvertently opened a door onto a category of human suffering the era was not yet equipped to fully see, let alone treat, a door that would not close again. And that medicine would spend the following century slowly, imperfectly, learning to walk through. Eliza will step off this train in a few hours with nothing more than tired feet and a stiff neck from the hard bench seat, and she will count herself, quite reasonably, fortunate for it. Not every passenger who boarded a Victorian train in this decade was so lucky, even among those who never set foot in a wrecked carriage at all. Manchester, when this train finally reaches it, keeps a different clock than the one Eliza set her late husband's pocket watch by in London, or at least it would have, only a few decades before this particular journey. If you imagine time itself as something fixed and universal, noon arriving at the same instant everywhere, a fact of nature rather than a human agreement, you are thinking about time the way the 20th century eventually taught nearly everyone on Earth to think about it. And you are thinking about it in a way that would have struck most of Eliza's grandparents as faintly puzzling. For most of human history, and for the whole of Britain, right up until the railway forced the issue, noon meant something specific and local. The precise moment the sun reached its highest point above a particular town, a fact that varied gradually and continuously as you moved east or west across the country. Noon in London arrived a little earlier than noon in Bristol, and earlier still than noon in the far west of Cornwall, because the sun simply reached each of those places at a slightly different moment. A difference that could run to 20 minutes or more between the eastern and western extremes of the island. For centuries, this discrepancy caused nobody any particular difficulty, because nobody needed their clock to agree precisely with a clock 200 miles away. A coach travelling from London to Bristol took the better part of a day, regardless of what time either city's church bells happened to be striking when it set off or arrived. The railway broke that comfortable indifference almost immediately, and it broke it for reasons that were entirely commercial rather than philosophical. A train company attempting to publish a single, reliable timetable across a network that might span several hundred miles, connecting London to Bristol, to Manchester, to Edinburgh, needed every station along that network to agree on what time it actually was. Because a train scheduled to depart Bristol at 10 o'clock and arrive in London at 12:30 created genuine, dangerous confusion if Bristol's 10 o'clock and London's 10 o'clock were not, in fact, the same moment. Worse, and more urgently, two trains approaching the same junction from different directions, each operating on its own city's local time, created exactly the kind of scheduling ambiguity that a tired signalman, already managing the punishing hours this account has already described, could least afford to untangle correctly under pressure. The railway companies solved this problem themselves well before Parliament or the public at large had fully caught up with the implications of what they were doing. The Great Western Railway began operating its own network on London time, commonly called Greenwich Mean Time after the Royal Observatory that calculated it, as early as 1840. distributing the correct time to its stations by telegraph, and instructing every clock on its property to disregard local solar time entirely in favor of a single unified standard set nearly 200 miles away in the London suburbs. Other companies followed over the following years, and by 1847, the Railway Clearinghouse, the industry body responsible for coordinating traffic and accounts between Britain's many competing railway companies, formally recommended that every company operating in Britain adopt Greenwich time as its standard, a recommendation the industry embraced with a speed that stood in notable contrast to how slowly it moved on some of the safety reforms this account has already examined. The public, for a time, lagged noticeably behind the railways in adopting this new artificial uniformity, and the resulting overlap produced some strange and confusing transitional years. A number of town halls and parish churches, particularly in the west of England where the gap between local time and London time was largest, kept two separate clock hands or two separate faces entirely for a period, one showing the town's own traditional solar time and one showing what quickly became known simply as railway time, so that a resident checking the church clock to see whether they had missed their train needed to be certain they were reading the correct hand. Gradually, over the following decades, local time simply lost the argument, not through any single dramatic act of legislation, but through the sheer accumulated convenience of a single national standard that made train travel, postal delivery, and increasingly ordinary business correspondence considerably simpler to coordinate. Britain would not formally enshrine Greenwich Mean Time as the country's single legal standard until an Act of Parliament in 1880. A full 4 decades after the Great Western Railway had first quietly adopted it for its own operational convenience, which meant that for much of Eliza's own lifetime, the practice had already been universal in every meaningful sense long before the law finally caught up to acknowledge it. Eliza checks her husband's watch as the train finally begins to slow for a scheduled stop. A small silver piece Thomas had carried through his years as a solicitor's clerk, and one of the very few objects of his she chose to keep rather than sell when she settled his modest estate. She had set it precisely against the great clock at Euston before departure, exactly as any experienced traveller learned to do. Because a watch even a few minutes out of alignment with railway time could mean missing a connection, and a missed connection on an unfamiliar journey to an unfamiliar city was not a small inconvenience for a woman travelling alone with limited funds and a new employer expecting her at a specific hour. The watch is not, in any sense she would have articulated aloud, simply a timepiece. It is one of the last physical threads connecting her to a marriage that ended 2 years earlier, and there is something she has never quite examined too closely in the small private ritual of checking it, station by station, against a national standard of time that did not exist when her own parents were young, a standard the railway itself had essentially invented and then imposed on an entire country within the span of a single working life. The broader context here reaches well beyond the narrow question of train scheduling, because the adoption of a single national time changed the texture of ordinary life in Britain in ways that went considerably deeper than simply making it easier to catch a connection. Railway historians, including Christian Woolmar, have described this standardization as one of the railway's most quietly transformative achievements, arguably more significant to the long-term shape of British society than any individual line or locomotive, because it created, for the first time, a single shared national present tense, a single hour that every factory whistle, every school bell, and every business appointment across the country could now be measured against with total precision. Factory owners, already reorganizing labor around the disciplined shift patterns industrialization demanded, found in railway time a natural ally, a single, externally verified standard that made coordinating shift changes, deliveries, and correspondence across distant branches of the same business dramatically simpler than the old patchwork of local solar time had ever allowed. The railway had set out simply to move people and goods more quickly across the map. In the process, almost as an afterthought, it had rewired the entire nation's relationship with the hour itself. There is something worth sitting with in how completely this change had already settled into ordinary, unremarkable habit by 1875, so thoroughly absorbed into daily life that a woman like Eliza, checking her watch against a station clock, would never have thought to describe the gesture as participating in one of the great, quiet revolutions of her century. She simply wanted to know whether she would make her connection. The railway, in giving her the means to know that with total confidence for the first time in human history, had also, without asking anyone's permission, redrawn the shape of time itself across an entire nation. One telegraph wire and one synchronized station clock at a stretch. If second-class travel meant a cold foot warmer, a locked door, and a stranger whose intentions could not be verified, third class meant all of that and a good deal more besides. And the gap between Eliza's compartment and the one just a few carriages behind hers was wide enough to count, in its own way, as a separate journey entirely. If you imagine the difference between Victorian rail classes as simply a matter of cushioning, softer seats in first class, plainer ones further back, you are picturing a distinction that had, by 1875, become considerably milder than the one earlier generations of third-class passengers had actually endured. When Britain's railways were new, in the 1830s and early 1840s, a great many companies carried their poorer passengers in what amounted to open goods wagons fitted with plank benches, roofless, unglazed, entirely exposed to rain, wind, and the same shower of hot cinders and ash this account has already described falling on passengers who merely opened a window in a proper carriage. A third-class passenger on one of these early services travelled the length of a journey fully exposed to the weather, arriving at their destination soaked, frozen, or coated in soot depending on the season, for a fare set low enough that the companies had little financial incentive to improve the experience so long as demand for the cheapest available seats kept the wagons full regardless. Parliament intervened in 1844 in an act of railway legislation associated with a young president of the Board of Trade named William Gladstone, requiring every railway company to run at least one train daily along each of its lines with fully enclosed, weatherproof carriages available at a fare no higher than a penny a mile, travelling no slower than 12 miles an hour. These became known, in the slightly mocking shorthand of the period, as parliamentary trains, and the requirement did improve the baseline experience of third-class travel across the network, ensuring that even the poorest passenger could no longer be legally carried in an open truck exposed to the elements. It did not, however, make third-class travel comfortable by any standard a wealthier passenger would have recognized as adequate. By 1875, third-class compartments on most lines were enclosed and roofed, a real and meaningful improvement over the earliest decades of the network, but they remained sparse, crowded, and largely unheated, hard wooden benches without upholstery. No foot warmers provided at any price on many services, and considerably less legroom packed into each compartment than a first or second-class passenger would have tolerated for a moment. Lighting, where it existed at all in third-class carriages after dark, was often dimmer and less reliable than in the classes ahead, a small but telling detail about where the companies chose to direct what limited investment they made in passenger comfort. Eliza has ridden third class exactly twice in her life, both times in the anxious months immediately following Thomas's death, when every shilling of fare mattered more than any consideration of comfort, and she remembers both journeys with a clarity that her more recent, marginally more comfortable second-class travel has not managed to erase. She remembers the particular ache of a wooden bench with no cushion beneath her for nearly 3 hours, the cold that had nothing at all standing between it and her body once the shared warmth of 6 or 7 crowded strangers proved inadequate to a truly cold evening, and the careful, exhausting vigilance of guarding her small remaining savings in a compartment considerably more crowded, and by her own private and perhaps unfair assessment, considerably less easy to read, than the more orderly second-class carriages she now, with real relief, could generally afford. She does not think of herself as fortunate tonight in any grand sense. Her situation remains precarious, her employment uncertain. Her finances thin enough that every fare she books is chosen with real care. But she is aware, distantly and without any particular satisfaction in the awareness that a few compartments behind her, passengers are enduring a version of this same journey considerably harder than her own, and that the difference between her evening and theirs amounts, in the end, to little more than the particular fare printed on two different tickets. The broader context matters here because the railway, for all the genuine democratizing power historians have rightly credited it with, spreading mobility to a working population that had previously been almost entirely confined to walking distance or, at best, an infrequent and expensive stagecoach, extended that mobility on terms that replicated, with remarkable fidelity, the exact class hierarchy already governing every other aspect of Victorian life. The historian Terry Coleman, whose studies of the railway's construction and social impact examined the lives of the labourers who built the network as closely as the passengers who eventually rode it, described the railway as a truly transformative force in British working-class life, even as it preserved, carriage by carriage, compartment by compartment, exactly the stratification the era considered natural and unremarkable. A wealthy passenger and a poor one might now travel the same 200 miles in the same number of hours for the first time in human history. An achievement worth taking seriously on its own terms. They did not travel it in anything resembling the same conditions, and nobody involved, from the company directors setting fares to the third-class passengers themselves, seems to have expected otherwise. There is something worth sitting with in how thoroughly this inequality had been built into the very architecture of the train itself. Carriage by carriage, compartment by compartment. A physical, load-bearing expression of a social order that required no explicit statement because it was simply poured into timber and iron and sold, without apology, at 3 different prices. Eliza's own journey tonight, cold feet and locked door and all, would have looked to a third-class passenger a few carriages behind her like a considerable comfort. Her own recent memory of exactly that harder journey is, perhaps, the clearest evidence in this entire account that comfort and danger on the Victorian railway were never absolute conditions, only points along a single sliding scale that every passenger, regardless of class, was riding together, at the same speed, toward the same uncertain destination. Somewhere past Stafford, with the worst of the journey behind her and perhaps 2 hours still remaining before Manchester, Eliza allows herself, for the first time all evening, to stop cataloguing hazards and simply watch the dark countryside slide past the window, and it is worth stepping back from her particular evening here to consider what the whole of it actually adds up to. Because the individual pieces of this account, taken one at a time, can start to feel like a list of unconnected miseries rather than the coherent picture they actually form. The first pattern worth naming is the sheer distance between what the railway promised and what riding it actually required of a passenger's body. A gap this account has returned to again and again without ever quite naming it directly. The engraving in the illustrated newspaper showed a train departing in a wreath of romantic steam. It did not show the locked door, the cold foot warmer, the smoke-filled tunnel, the absent lavatory, or the stranger whose intentions a solitary woman had no way of verifying until the journey was already over. This was not particularly a matter of deception in any deliberate sense. Nobody at the London and North Western Railway sat down and decided to conceal these realities from the travelling public. It was simply that the romance sold tickets and the discomfort did not, and so the romance is what ended up on the posters, in the same quiet, unspoken arrangement that governs how nearly every era chooses to advertise its own defining technology. The steam engine was, and remains, a genuine marvel of the age. The marvel and the misery rode the same rails, in the same carriages, on the very same journey, and the era's advertising simply chose, again and again, which half of that truth to put in front of the paying customer. The second pattern concerns endurance, and it may be the most important one this account has to offer, because it reframes nearly everything Eliza has experienced tonight, not as passive suffering, but as a specific, learned competence. She did not simply tolerate the locked door, the cold, the smoke, and the vigilance her solitary status required of her. She managed all of it, actively and continuously, drawing on years of accumulated, hard-won knowledge about which tea to avoid, which window to close before a known tunnel, where to position her bag, and how to hold herself so that a stranger's ordinary courtesy and a stranger's genuine threat could be told apart quickly enough to matter. None of this was heroic in any dramatic sense, and Eliza herself would likely have found the word faintly ridiculous applied to an ordinary evening's travel. But it was skill, real and hard-won, the specific, unglamorous expertise of a body that had learned to survive a system never designed with its particular vulnerabilities fully in mind. The same was true of the signalman managing his post through the 20th hour of an unrelieved shift, and of the guard walking his footboard checking Muller's lights at every stop, and of the surgeon trying to name a condition medicine had no adequate language for yet. The railway ran, night after night, not because its engineering was flawless, but because an enormous, largely uncelebrated quantity of ordinary human competence was quietly filling in every gap the engineering left behind. The third pattern concerns time itself, and it connects directly back to the small silver watch Eliza checked against the station clock only a few hours ago. The railway did not simply move her body from London to Manchester at a speed her grandmother would have found difficult to credit. It moved her into a new and, on the whole, more demanding relationship with the clock, a national standard of time that made her responsible, in a way no earlier generation of travellers had ever needed to be, for arriving at a precise station at a precise minute, connections calculated to the moment. An employer in Manchester expecting her at a specific hour on a specific evening, rather than simply sometime before the week was out. The railway shrank distance and, in nearly the same motion, tightened the grip of the schedule on everybody who depended on it, a trade that looks, from the vantage point of a later century thoroughly accustomed to living by the clock, almost too obvious to mention. And that would have struck Eliza's own grandparents as one of the stranger and more demanding aspects of the modern world their grandchildren had somehow agreed to accept without much protest. The fourth pattern, and the one that ties most directly back to the third-class carriages riding a few compartments behind Eliza's own, concerns exactly who was asked to bear the largest share of this bargain's risk in exchange for the smallest share of its comfort. Wealthier passengers could afford the saloon carriages with their private lavatories, could better absorb the cost of a first-class fare that still locked its doors and still lacked a corridor, but at least offered softer seats and a marginally more reliable foot warmer. Poorer passengers rode the same speed toward the same destination in conditions considerably harder than Eliza's own, and in the event of a derailment or a collision, rode in carriages built to exactly the same flawed wooden design as every other class, absorbing the same catastrophic risk without any of the compensating comfort available further up the train. The railway was, in this specific and quite literal sense, a remarkably honest machine. It did not pretend that speed and safety were being distributed equally. It simply built that inequality directly into its timetables and its fare classes, and let every passenger who bought a ticket understand, without needing it explained, exactly what their money had, and had not purchased them. None of these patterns are offered here as an indictment of the Victorians for building the system this way, because doing so would require pretending that a different, safer, more equitable version of rapid mass transportation was simply sitting on a shelf somewhere, available and ignored out of malice or indifference. It was not. The engineers, the surgeons, the signalmen, and the company directors who built this network were working at the very edge of what their era's materials, medicine, and understanding of large-scale risk actually allowed, solving problems that had literally never existed before their own working lives. often figuring out the correct answer only after a specific tragedy. A Briggs, a Staplehurst, an Armour still 2 decades in this particular evening's future, forced the question into public view where it could no longer be quietly deferred. The gap between the romantic engraving and the locked, cold, smoke-filled compartment was not a lie so much as it was the honest, unfinished state of a technology still in the middle of learning what it actually required of the bodies riding inside it. What remains, at the center of all 4 of these patterns, is a woman on an ordinary train on an ordinary November evening, managing a body that is cold, mildly anxious, and quietly competent in ways she has never once thought to describe to herself in those terms. She is not remarkable. That is, in its own way, the entire point of spending an evening inside her particular journey rather than inside the life of someone whose name made it into a newspaper. Millions of passengers just like her rode the Victorian railway network in these exact years, absorbing exactly this combination of marvel and hazard into the unremarked texture of ordinary travel, arriving at their destinations tired, a little sooty, and mostly, blessedly, unharmed. The railway asked a great deal of them in exchange for what it gave them. Almost without exception, they paid it, boarded the next locked compartment when the time came, and simply carried on. The train begins its final approach into Manchester a little after 10 o'clock, gas lamps along the platform swimming into view through a window streaked with the accumulated soot of nearly 200 miles. And Eliza feels the particular, unmistakable change in the rhythm of the wheels beneath her that every experienced traveller learns to recognize long before any guard announces it aloud. The journey is nearly over. In a few minutes, a key will turn in the lock from the outside, exactly as it did at Euston 5 hours ago. Only this time the sound will mean release rather than confinement. The small mechanical click that returns her, at last, to a world she can move through freely rather than one she has simply been permitted to sit inside. Picture her again as she was at the start of this account, crossing the great hall at Euston in her dark wool cloak and her practical bonnet, walking with the composed, upright bearing of a woman who had rehearsed, in her own mind, exactly how a respectable person travels alone. That image was accurate as far as it went. It was also, in every way this account has since tried to make visible, radically incomplete, a single still photograph of a woman about to spend 5 hours managing a body against a machine that had never been designed with her particular needs fully in mind. You now know what that composed, upright walk across the station hall was actually about to cost her. You know about the guard's key turning in the lock behind her, sealing her into a wooden box with no corridor and no lavatory, for stretches of the journey that could run well over an hour at a time. You know about the tea she declined at the station buffet out of long-practiced caution, and the woolen stockings folded carefully into her bag against a cold no-foot warmer could hold off for more than an hour or 2. You know about the hatpin secured through the crown of her bonnet, and the quiet, practiced vigilance she maintained toward a stranger who, in the end, gave her no real cause for alarm at all, though she had no way of knowing that for certain until the journey was already finished. You know about Thomas Briggs, murdered in a compartment very much like her own 11 years before this particular evening, and about the communication cord near her window that would have summoned help only slowly and imperfectly had she ever actually needed it. You know about the wooden walls around her, no stronger in the event of a serious accident than the splintered carriages at Staplehurst had proven to be a decade earlier. You know about the signalman standing unseen watch somewhere out in the dark, working hours that would strike any modern observer as an open invitation to catastrophe, and about the condition doctors were still struggling to name, let alone treat, in passengers whose nerves never fully recovered from an accident that left no visible mark on their bodies at all. You know about the third-class passengers riding a few carriages behind her in conditions harder than her own, and about the small silver watch in her hand, keeping a national, standardized time that had not existed at all when her own parents were the age she is now. None of that is a small accounting. Laid out end to end, it reads like a catalogue of everything that could plausibly have gone wrong on a single ordinary evening's travel, and by any honest measure, very little of it actually did. Eliza arrives in Manchester tired, cold through the soles of her boots, her gloves faintly grey with soot she will need to clean before tomorrow's introduction to her new employers, and otherwise entirely whole. Exactly as the overwhelming majority of Victorian rail passengers arrived at the end of the overwhelming majority of Victorian rail journeys. She is not a survivor in any dramatic sense. She would likely find the word faintly absurd applied to her own uneventful evening. And yet survival, in the quieter and more accurate sense this account has tried to establish throughout, is precisely what she has just accomplished. A body successfully managed through 5 hours of cold, confinement, smoke, uncertainty, and risk that her own grandmother's generation never had to reckon with at all, because her grandmother's generation never moved fast enough to reckon with any of it. The guard's key turns. The door swings open onto a platform loud with the ordinary business of a busy northern terminus late in the evening. Porters calling. A locomotive somewhere further up the platform releasing steam with a long, exhausted hiss of its own. Eliza steps down, retrieves her trunk from the guard's van, with the help of a porter she tips with one of her carefully counted coins, and stands for a moment on the platform gathering her bearings in a city she has never once set foot in before tonight. Somewhere beyond the station gates, a cab waits to carry her the final short distance to an address she has only ever seen written on a letter, and a household of strangers who will, by tomorrow morning, become the people she works for, eats with, and answers to for however long this particular position lasts. She is 32 years old, a widow with a small trunk, a dwindling supply of savings, and a good hand for penmanship, standing on an unfamiliar platform in an unfamiliar city, having just crossed nearly 200 miles of England in considerably less time than her own mother would have believed possible. She is not, in this moment, thinking about locomotives or locked doors or the particular engineering compromises of mid-Victorian carriage design. She is thinking, most immediately, about whether the Ashworth household will have kept supper waiting for her, and whether her handwriting, the one thing about herself she has always quietly trusted, will prove as impressive in person as it apparently read on paper. She is thinking, in other words, exactly the ordinary, forward-looking thoughts of anyone arriving somewhere new to begin something uncertain, and there is a real dignity in that ordinariness, in the fact that a body which has just spent 5 hours managing cold, smoke, confinement, and quiet vigilance can step off a train and immediately turn its full attention towards supper and first impressions, the way resilient people generally do, without any particular ceremony about what they have just come through. That, in the end, may be the truest thing this account has to offer about Eliza and about the millions of ordinary Victorian travellers whose journeys she stands in for tonight. They were not fragile. The romantic engravings of departing trains, all steam and gaslight and dignified composure, were not entirely wrong about the people riding those trains, only incomplete, because dignity and composure, it turns out, were not incompatible with cold feet, soot-stained gloves, and a hatpin held in careful readiness the entire way. She managed her own body through a system that asked a great deal of it and offered remarkably little reassurance in return, and she managed it well enough that by tomorrow morning, this particular evening will have folded itself quietly into the unremarkable category of journeys completed, filed away alongside every other ordinary hardship a Victorian body learned to carry, without much comment. The railway itself did not slow down to consider any of this. Within a few years of Eliza's journey, corridors would begin creeping into ordinary carriage design, driven less by any single burst of engineering brilliance than by decades of accumulated public fear. Briggs and Staplehurst and Armagh, and 100 smaller, less remembered incidents, each one chipping away a little more insistence from a public that had grown tired of boarding locked wooden boxes and hoping for the best. Lavatories would follow the corridors. Continuous breaks and proper block signaling would eventually relieve the signalman of the impossible burden this account has spent time describing. Doctors would spend the better part of a century slowly, imperfectly working out what railway spine had actually been trying to tell them about the relationship between a shocked mind and a suffering body. None of that reform arrived quickly enough to spare Eliza or the thousands of passengers who travelled these same rails in these same years. Any of the specific discomforts and dangers this account has tried to make vivid rather than abstract. Reform, as this account has had occasion to note more than once, rarely arrives in time for the people whose experience eventually makes the case for it. What the railway did give her, in exchange for everything it demanded, was a version of mobility no human being in the history of the world had ever possessed before her own century made it ordinary. A journey her grandmother would have needed the better part of 2 days to complete. At considerable expense and real physical hardship of its own, Eliza had just finished in a single evening, arriving with time enough left to worry about supper. That exchange, speed purchased at the price of confinement, danger, and a body's quiet, constant vigilance, was the actual bargain every Victorian rail passenger struck the moment they stepped through a station gate, whether they ever thought about it in those terms or not. It was not a fair bargain by any modern standard. It was, by the standards of the world it replaced, an extraordinary one nonetheless, and Eliza, climbing into a hired cab outside Manchester station with her trunk and her savings and her one good reference in hand, was living proof that ordinary people could meet its terms and come through the other side of it. Tired, sooty, and entirely intact, the cab pulls away from the station into streets she does not yet recognize. Gas lamps passing overhead in a rhythm considerably slower and gentler than the one she has spent the last 5 hours inside. Somewhere behind her, the train she arrived on sits at its platform being readied for its next journey. Its foot warmers refilled, its compartments checked. Its doors soon to be locked again from the outside for another set of passengers she will never meet, each one about to learn, in their own way, exactly what her own evening has just taught her. The lamps along the platform burn low and steady in the cold night air. The journey is finished. Eliza rides on into whatever her new life holds, carrying nothing more dramatic than a trunk, a letter of reference, and a body that did, in the end, exactly what it needed to do to get her here.